talk a little bit about compare and contrast. So we're going to go over kind of the basics today, since this is both a familiar topic, but it might not be something you've done in a while. So, you know, in our previous essay PowerPoints, when we've gone over our first one and then the definition essay, we've talked specifically about like organizing, like how to organize an introduction, and body paragraph, and conclusion. We are going to do that for this one, but because compare and contrast requires a bit more information to even begin, we're going to spend today going over that information. So, I actually want to begin with an example, and something that I'm sure most of us can relate to. So how many of you have been unable to sleep recently, and maybe you've been watching a little bit more Netflix or Hulu than normal? Okay, yeah, that's what I thought, myself included. So let's kind of use the example of an insomniac watching some late night television, and they face a choice, right? Two different Halloween movies broadcasting at the same time, or if we're streaming, right, two different options. Which one do we choose? And to make up their mind, they use the dual method, right? The dual method of comparison and contrast. Dual method meaning these are two different approaches, all right? So while most of us probably know what these are, let's go over them specifically. Comparison shows the similarities between two or more subjects. So for example, the similar broadcast times and topics of the two movies. Contrast, on the other hand, shows the differences between subjects. For example, the different actors, the location or setting, or even time period, the reputations of the two movies, and these all together make it possible for the insomniac to choose one. Good to move on? So, as in this example, comparison and contrast usually work together because any subject that warrants side-by-side examination usually resemble each other in some respects and differ in other respects. So you will generally write a compare and contrast for two purposes. In other words, there are two main reasons why you would use this method. And I'm going to skip ahead here and then we'll go over each one. They are explanatory comparison and evaluative comparison. And we're going to go over both. I'm going to give you plenty of time to write both down. So the first one is an explanatory, or simply one that explains. Explain meaning spreading information. So to explain similarities and differences between subjects so as to make either or both of them more clear, you would use an explanatory, or that would be an explanatory comparison. To evaluate subjects so as to establish their advantages and disadvantages, their strengths and their weaknesses, is an evaluative comparison. So you are evaluating the two of them. An evaluative comparison is most closely resembled to a persuasive essay, because you are sort of analyzing it in a way that says, either implicitly or explicitly, this one is better, this is my preference, right? And here is why. Any questions so far? Great. So we've got two different kinds of compare and contrast. We explain or we evaluate. Furthermore, the explanatory doesn't take a position on the relative merits of the subject, whereas the evaluative does, and it usually, like I said, concludes with either a preference or a suggested course of action, right? So just like in our original essay, our first essay we wrote in this class, you were arguing a preference either for or against Common Core, and some of you even suggested a course of action. Examples of both of these might include, for instance, in an explanatory comparison, you might show how new income tax law differ from old ones. But using that same subject in an evaluative comparison, you might argue that the old laws are more equitable than the new ones are. Right? Does that make sense? Cool. Alright, so let's talk about using the method. So whether you are explaining or evaluating, comparisons treat two or more subjects in the same general class or group. Alright? So I'm just going to list some examples here that we're going to work with later on in the PowerPoint. We have tax law, like we just talked about. Religions. Attitudes toward marriage, right? So things like what should marriage look like, right? Diseases. Advertising strategies. Diets. Contact sports. Friends and television shows, right? So we're going to take a look later on at diets. There is a lot of compare and contrast essays we can look at specifically with regard to diets. So, personally, I'm vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian since I was 18 years old, right? But a lot of my friends who are also fairly active disagree, right? They ask me questions about, do you get enough protein, right? I'm keto, or I'm paleo, or my CrossFit instructor says I need to eat this, right? So that is something that is hugely up for debate, and it's something that a lot of my friends compare and contrast without even realizing, right? I've been in the locker room, I've been outside the gym, and we've had whole compare and contrast essays, right, that we've just spoken to casually. So you may define the class, which is, again, that general category to suit your interests. So for example, maybe you just focus on crime dramas, or cable news programs, or on classic sitcoms, right? The class or the category likeness ensures that the subjects share enough features to make comparison worthwhile, right? If you were to compare subjects from different classes, such as an insect and a tree, the similarities are so few and the differences are so numerous that, explaining them would be pointless, right? And we can also take class literally, right? So if we were to just compare AP and dual enrollment, as I did in the beginning of the year, right? Those are similar enough to talk about. But if we're simply comparing first grade to 11th grade, there would hardly be anything worthwhile to comment on because the differences are so obvious. Make sense? Cool. All right. So in writing of comparison, you select subjects from the same class, and then using either division or analysis, and we'll talk about those, identify the features shared by the subjects. Alright? So these are called the points of comparison. And don't get caught up on division or analysis yet, because we're going to go over this. So the points of comparison are the attributes of the class or category, and those words are interchangeable there, class and category, and thus of the subjects within the class. So let's go back to diet, alright? So for instance, the points of comparison for diets, so the different parts of that we're comparing might be how quickly you lose weight, the speed of weight loss, the required self-discipline, right? Do we get to eat ice cream or no, right? Do we gotta work out as a part of this or no? The nutritional risk, right? Are we jeopardizing an important part of our nutrition simply to lose weight? For example, if we were to talk about air pollutants, they may be dangerous to plants, animals, humans. These points will help you arrange your similarities and differences between subjects, and more importantly, they ensure direct comparison rather than a random listing of unrelated characteristics. So sometimes I get essays and it's literally just a random list, right? And it's like, okay, I could have just Googled both of these, read the Wikipedia articles, and I would have gathered as much, if not more, information from your essay. So your job as the writer is to tell us, what do we take away from this seemingly random list? Or, in other words, how do we relate these lists in a way that sheds new light on both subjects? Alright, so make sure we are definitely writing down this slide, because these are going to be the two different arrangement styles when composing or writing a compare and contrast. Okay? So when we have two or more subjects, we have several points of comparison, we have many similarities and differences. Comparison clearly requires you being able to organize them, right? That's the hardest part. How are we going to take all this information and not write or avoid the most confusing essay we've ever written, right? So we use arrangement styles to ground us in an organizational method. The first, and we'll go over examples of both of these, the first is subject by subject. Alright? So subject by subject. This is when the points of comparison are grouped under each subject so that the subjects are covered one at a time. An example of this would be, suppose you are writing an essay comparing and contrasting dual enrollment with AP. You're going to spend the first half of the essay talking about dual enrollment, under which you are listing all of the benefits of dual enrollment, as well as some of the risks or potential liabilities, right? The second half of your essay then is AP. What are the benefits of AP? What are the potential liabilities? So your essay is divided into two sections, AP dual enrollment, and then you're kind of using those as umbrellas, and you stand underneath the umbrella and you give us your speech on each. The second method is point by point, right? So this is when you take the points, or the categories of points that you would use, and subject by subject, and you start there. All right? So, this is probably for you. Let me grab this. Good morning, Thompson. Sure do. Sure can. All right. Riley, just make sure you view Teams. There's an article that we'll need to read for Friday. It's only like 3 minutes. All right, so back to the point by point. Help me out here now. What are some reasons people would take either dual enrollment or AP? What's like the most obvious? Yeah. College credit. Okay? So in a point by point, we're going to start there. So, hey, I'm an administrator, I'm a school counselor, you want to earn college credit, great. So your options for college credit, see you later, Riley, are both AP and dual enrollment, right? So here's what AP has to offer, okay? You go all year, you hopefully pass a test. If you don't, no college credit whatsoever, right? Best I can give you is a boost in your GPA, right? However, with dual enrollment, you pass my class, you get the credit, period, right? Also, you get Mr. Thompson, which helps, right? So, you guys were supposed to laugh there. It's okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Right? What's another reason why you would consider either or, as opposed to just going through the motions with English 3 or 4? Yeah. Getting ahead, you're challenging yourself, right? So maybe the next point is difficulty, right? Which one is more difficult? And as we mentioned at the beginning of this class, right? That's subjective in itself. For some people, one is more difficult than the other, right? If you come from a very structured, like you need a bit more hand-holding, sometimes AP is your go-to. But if you're more open-ended and you're okay with, pacing yourself, right? You're okay with a bit more freedom and independence and autonomy with regard to what you write, well then maybe you might actually find dual enrollment easier. And those are both things you talked about in a point by point. All right? Does that make sense? So for my visual learners, let's kind of group these, right? So we're gonna do a similar example with diet, okay? And we're just gonna come up with 2 names, all right? So we have the Harris's diet and the Marconi's diet, okay? These are just 2 random diets. Subject by subject, just like our AP and dual enrollment, we're going to talk about the Harris diet. So the first thing we're going to talk about is speed of weight loss, required self-discipline, nutritional risk. Then we're going to move on, next paragraph, to the Marconi's diet, speed of weight loss, required self-discipline, or nutritional risk. Maybe each of these is their own paragraph, right? But we're going to do 3 paragraphs about one, 3 paragraphs about another. Got it? Alternatively, we can go point by point. So, first section of my paper, speed of weight loss. Second section, required self-discipline. Third section, nutritional risk. And underneath each section, we've got a part for one diet and a part for the other. So far, so good? Cool. So since the subject by subject arranges each subject as a coherent unit, it's particularly useful for comparing impressions of subjects, right? So the dissimilar characteristics of 2 friends, for instance. However, covering subjects one at a time can break an essay into discrete pieces and sometimes strain the reader's memories. So this arrangement is usually confined to essays that are short or that compare several subjects briefly. So if you're just giving us a quick pitch, right? Think about if you only had 30 seconds in an elevator to convince a student to take AP or dual enrollment, which method would you use? Yeah. Well, if you only had 30 seconds, subject by subject, right? So, like, we're rushed, elevator door is about to open. Okay, very quickly, AP, bump, 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 right? Point, 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 point. Dual enrollment, bump, 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 right? Okay, boom, got it? If we had more time, if you said, hey, my office is on this floor, why don't you come into my office and I'll sit down with you for a couple minutes and we'll really explore both options, then you go point by point, right? You say, okay, so-and-so, let's say James, what do you most want to get out of either class? Well, I want to earn college credit. Okay, so here's how this can earn you college credit versus this, right? You go point by point that way. So if you have more time to spend with your reader, it's point by point. If you're trying to get the point across quickly, it's subject by subject. As I was saying, right? So for longer papers, point by point, its only disadvantage there is that sometimes readers can get lost in the details and fail to see the subject as a whole. This is why it's important to constantly refer back to your overall idea, right? Just as you would in any other paper, refer back to the thesis statement. In any compare and contrast, make sure you're zooming out a little bit, right? Make sure you take that 0.5 and show your reader, hey, this is the whole picture. Just want to remind you, here's a wide angle lens on the whole picture. Okay, back to the points, right? Any questions before we move on to our next thing? Feel like you guys got a good overview? Alright, so on Friday, we're going to go over the essay we're about to read. And then we will continue kind of talking about these, go over some more examples. That's when we'll get into our actual how do we develop intro, body, and conclusion. Sound good?